The first part that we're going to talk about is we have two great speakers, and with this we have Amber Early, master students at K-State University, and Dr. Mariah Johnson with Senior Director of Research for National Cattlemen's Beef Association. One of the great things that the National Grazing Coalition got to do this, and appreciate Amber, all of her hard work, is we got to partner with NCBA and look at some key research areas. And one of those areas that we asked and we kind of collaborated with NCBA was around mental health. So we're going to have these two young ladies kind of talk about the research and the findings on mental health. And then we'll follow up with Debbie Lyons-Blythe, rancher there in Kansas, and we'll kind of tag team with me. I think she's kind of wrapped me into this conversation, which is just fine, talking about the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and some of the tools and efforts that producers, but the whole industry, and looking forward to that discussion. So with that, I'll just hand it off to Amber.
All right, is my mic on now? Okay, we're good. So like Chad said, I'm Amber Early at Kansas State in the Ag Econ department, a master's student. However, I am from Boonville, Missouri, and grew up on a cattle ranch and row crop farm there. So happy to be in Kansas, but Missouri's home for me. And then I'll let Mariah introduce herself a little bit more.
Sure. I'm Mariah Johnson, and I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability Research at NCBA. And so in that program, we have a wide variety of things going on in sustainability research, and so work with usually academic partners across the U.S. who are looking at a variety of sustainability related topics. And so the further that we move into the social sustainability realm, certainly the people aspect is one that keeps coming up again, and is how we kind of got to this topic. And as Chad mentioned, working together to kind of look at what are some of those mental health stressors and how are they specific to the beef industry, and what do we know about that, and where are some of those gaps?
Yeah, so with that, I do kind of want to make a statement that I'm an Ag Econ master's student. Mariah's background is in animal science and Ag Econ, so we're not mental health experts by any means, but being interested and passionate about the beef industry, it's something that we kind of wanted to focus in on from a social standpoint. So kind of a disclaimer there. But so to give a general overview of what we're going to talk about today, like Mariah said, the beef industry is very, it has a lot of things about it that are different than a lot of other industries, especially outside of agriculture. And with that, beef producers have very unique demographics that make them unlike so many other people. And I don't have to tell you a lot about the sources of stress in the beef industry because a lot of you guys live that every day, but they're very different than a 9-to-5 job, right? So we're gonna talk a little bit about that and how that in mental health discussions, but especially in agriculture, there's some intense stigma that's related to those discussions, and that's a barrier in the industry. So we need to work towards a better understanding of that. And again, more barriers are the accessibility, availability, and acceptance of mental health resources among the agriculture industry and specifically the beef industry. So that's kind of the areas we wanted to focus in on for this talk.
And so, like we have alluded to in the sustainability research program, of course, sustainability covers a wide variety of topics, and those generally fall in 3 pillar areas, being the social, the economic, and the environmental areas. But while we think of mental health probably belonging in that social pillar, in that human piece, that also has relations to the other areas of sustainability as well. Because we know when times are economically challenging, that can have a major impact on someone's mental health. And likewise, if you are suffering or struggling and have those challenges with mental health, that can certainly impact other areas of your operation, as Amber will get into a little bit later, but can certainly be an indicator that there are some struggles going on there. And so we know that cattle producers, all of you know, you're sitting here, that there's a great amount of resilience in this industry and are also known for their independence, which is wonderful characteristics and traits, but it can also make it challenging when you're faced with a challenge such as mental health in seeking out the help that might be needed. And so this graph here just broadly shows kind of that wide array of topics that fall within sustainability within the beef industry. And so we're going to hone in just on, I would say a few, but a lot of the topics that are underneath here. And so when we think about social sustainability, and sometimes we have a hard time defining what that is, or even what topics fall within social sustainability. And just because one box appears under social doesn't mean that it doesn't have connectedness to either the economic or the environmental pillar as well. Because we really see that so many of these things play off of one another. And so within kind of this social piece, certainly safety, when we have mental health pieces, maybe we're not as concerned or we're not as focused. And so that can get us into a lot more accidents as well. There's also that community relatedness aspect, animal welfare, ecosystem services, and then even health and nutrition within that social arena. And then within economics, certainly things like efficiency and yield, financial viability, or just even the economic impact. And then environmental, greenhouse gases, water, land, and certainly that mental health piece relates to all of these. Because if we're not in a good mental space, we're probably not taking as good of care of the land or of the water, which impacts those ecosystem services. Again, it impacts, it's a two-way street with that economics. When we have something that's economically challenging, that's tough on us mentally, but then it can also affect how we run our operation, the decisions we make, and so maybe not the most optimal outcomes there. So again, that's just kind of a broad opening, and those are a lot of the topics that we're thinking about at NCBA within our sustainability research program, and so a lot of breadth and depth. And so this was an area, especially as we think about what are the places that we're going to do future research, or where we're going to award grants or partner. We'll do some internal research first ourselves to try to get a better understanding and look at where the gaps are in the research. And so this was certainly one of those projects where we said we need to get a better understanding of this ourselves and to understand better how this applies to the beef industry specifically, and not just agriculture in general, to help us find our footing of where to go next within our sustainability research program. So I'll hand it back over to Amber, and she'll kind of walk us through what she was able to find and identifying some of those gaps.
Thanks, Mariah. So I'd say within the last few years in farm press and national press even, we've seen a lot of media coverage on the topic of mental health in the agriculture industry, and certainly on the suicide rates of farmers as well. So I just wanted to point this out, that this is something that society as a whole is more concerned with. And I want to draw specific attention to the one in the middle that's talking about the USDA grants. I think USDA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, they're actually devoting quite a bit of money towards this topic. So, it's increasingly important in society, and like Mariah said, the sustainability of the industry. And not only is Farm Press concerned about it, but USA Today is also picking up on it. So kind of just as a jumping off point, it's something that is getting a lot of consideration right now. So back to the demographics of beef producers that make them a little bit different from the rest of the population. So we know that farmers are at higher risk for fatal and non-fatal injuries, but one thing that makes agriculture a little bit different is, your family is also at risk. They're not immune from the injuries. If you work in the oil field, one person is at risk for injuries, but at home, I'm just as at risk as my dad is in some cases, right? And that makes, the stress component a little more challenging. We can't get away from that. And if you get injured at work, it's also known that that can, have a heavier mental burden. So if you're living on your operation, that can be a challenge, right? And again, agriculture continually ranks as one of the most dangerous professions, in that farmers have the highest rate of death due to other stress-related conditions. So kind of as a backdrop, farmers live a very unique lifestyle, and they enjoy it, but there's also a lot of risks that come with that can impact your mental state. And again, I don't have to stand up and tell this audience about the sources of stress that farmers have, because like I said, you guys live it every day. But throughout the research that I did, the two things that one resource called the Twin Towers of Stress, were economic conditions or commodity prices, and weather uncertainty and variability. And again, that's something that we know, right? And also time pressures. We know that farmers don't work a 9-to-5 job, 40 hours a week. There's lots of competing interests for their time, which again can be a mental burden for them. And like the last slide hinted to and alluded to, a lot of times farmers have poor physical health. And when you're not able to perform your job as well as you could yesterday or 10 years ago, that's a challenge. But one thing that the literature called out that I was kind of shocked with, and maybe it's not surprising, was that farmers are increasingly more isolated than they were, and especially more than other industries. And because of that, it's harder to know when to get help. But again, literature after literature, paper after paper talked about the isolation. I don't think that's something that farmers would say about themselves. It's certainly not something I thought about, but it's a barrier and it's a source of stress. When you're having a hard time, it's okay, but when you're having a bad time, the isolation can be kind of draining. And kind of a note that I thought was interesting, 50 years ago, there was a lot more farmers around. You had a stronger community of farmers and ranchers around. And in some ways, there's less people in ag because we're more efficient, we're more mechanized. You don't need as many people to do the same job as you did several years ago, which is a good thing from an economic standpoint in many cases, right? But it's made the industry more isolated, and from a mental health standpoint, that can be a challenge. So again, I just kind of created this diagram to look at this idea of stress pileup. And again, that was something that the literature talked about a little bit. Economic uncertainty, weather uncertainty, time pressures, but even herd health and personal health was something that was mentioned in literature a lot. That's something I see in my dad when we have some cattle sick or he unfortunately might have to put an animal down. That's a burden on him, and I actually see it increase with age. That's something harder for him as the years go by. It's harder for him to see his animals struggling. And that leads to this idea of stress pileup, which also kind of moves right into the idea of burnout. And that's something that literature also hit on quite a bit, the idea that burnout is a result of chronic workplace stress that has been not successfully managed. And kind of like I talked about earlier, in most occupations, employees can take time off. And for many reasons, that's almost impossible in the beef industry, and which is a little different than other agriculture industries, right? So with row crop producers, you can put the corn in the ground and have a little bit of time. If you need to step away for a day or two, that might be an option. But for cattle producers, you have a living, breathing animal that you're responsible for. And even from a logistics standpoint, even if you could find someone to take over your operation, if you need a break and you are able to realize you need a break, that comes at a cost. And sometimes that cost is hard to cover, right? So it's hard to step away sometimes, and that can amplify this idea of burnout. So a little bit more on burnout. We talked about how farmers live a very stressful life. And sometimes when you have long-term stresses, it's hard to recognize, and that can lead to burnout, which affects moral and ethical beliefs. And it kind of comes from being challenged with situations that don't have easy outcomes. And again, that's something that farmers are unfortunately faced with a lot. Sometimes the ideal decision is hard to make, and it's can take a lot to get there. And kind of, so this idea of moral injury and moral distress came from an article in this vet magazine. And it talked about kind of the relationship of veterinarians, but also cattle producers, and what burnout means for them. And they talk about the idea of moral injury as the damage done to meet the moral and ethical damage done to moral and ethical compass when engaging in activities that don't line up with your due north. So that's when you're doing things that don't feel great, but they're in the best interest of the herd. And kind of like I talked about earlier, when you have to make a decision that doesn't have an easy outcome, or there's challenges, whether those be economic challenges or regulatory challenges, you might not sleep great after that decision, right? Even though it was in the best decision of the herd. And living a lifestyle where that's common can lead to moral distress. So again, I don't think I have to tell this audience about the stigma that's in the industry, but farmers continually recognize stigma as one of the main reasons that almost prohibits them from seeking mental health resources. And this, the American Farm Bureau Federation in 2019 put out a poll, and farmers and farm workers reported that the media, their community, and friends and family attach some level of stigma to mental health. And they also noted that 65% of them noted that it was important to reduce that stigma in the industry. So farmers are continually recognizing the stigma in the industry, and they see a role of community in overcoming that challenge. So we know that farmers and ranchers really do rely on, family operations. They rely on community, and they see a role of community in reducing stigma in the industry. However, they do recognize that, we have a long way to go to overcome that stigma. And something that I'm not going to hit on a lot in this conversation, but I wanted to really pull out this idea is suicide. And one source really emphasized that suicide rates represent the most dreaded outcome of a poor mental health state, and that those statistics simply can't be used to provide a comprehensive view of an issue that's very personal and complex as mental health. And I really like this idea because it's not, I'm okay, or I'm at the extreme point of suicide. There's lots of different levels when you're facing mental health challenges. Like we talked about burnout, that's not always super extreme, but it's important steps. So it's not all or nothing. It's not I'm okay or I'm absolutely not okay. There's a lot of states in the middle where it's important to recognize that and not push it off. And I think when we only talk about suicide rates in the industry, we really miss that key complexity of the challenges that are being faced. So a lot of the literature talked about some differences between men and women in the beef industry when it comes to mental health, and this is very important because out of all agriculture, the beef industry has the largest percentage of female operators, and a lot of the research showed that women may be impacted more by the farm stress and mental health conditions on the farm. And they also talked about how this may be because sometimes the woman is more often the one with off-farm jobs, so they're juggling both farm responsibilities and a job in town. And in some cases, they're also responsible for being the primary caretaker of other family members. And another key point that they talked about how, this is one that kind of stuck out to me, was a lot of times women are more likely to talk about their partner's health but ignore their own health. And growing up in an ag community, I can kind of relate to that. It's easier to talk about your husband's health or your dad's health, but not talk about your own health, right? And another thing that me and Mariah thought that was super interesting, we kind of had this aha moment, was one of the literature's papers specifically talked about how sometimes like daughters and daughter-in-laws of the family can feel more stress in the operation because they may have less decision-making power, but they're still, their lifestyle and their finances come directly from the farm. So although they're not able, in some cases, to make a lot of the decisions that affect the operation, they're still very much impacted by that, and that can be a source of stress for a lot of people in the industry. And like I said, that was something that Mariah and I could kind of relate to a little bit. And then talking about men in the industry and their help-seeking habits in agriculture, farmers have this traditional masculine image, which can be really good for them in the good times. They have to have thick skin. Their lifestyle is challenging. So like I said, throughout your life, that's a good quality to have, to be resilient. However, in the hard times, that can kind of lead to them to not address their mental health issues when times get tough. So, in some cases, the traditional masculine image can be a really good positive thing, but can also lead to them not seeking the help they need. However, Dr. Rossman, he's out of Iowa, and he's been practicing in the mental health field, and specifically in agriculture, for a very long time. And he said that, in the past, it was mostly women reaching out on behalf of their husband with mental health concerns, but he noted that there's been an increase in men seeking treatment on their own. So, recently he said that over half of the people that reach out to him are men, which is encouraging for the industry, right? So kind of the challenge that we looked at a little bit was knowing when to get help and taking those first steps of getting help. And we talked about how because the lifestyle of farmers and ranchers is stressful and there's that stress can pile up, it's kind of hard to recognize that, hey, maybe today is worse than yesterday and worse than last year from a mental health standpoint. So it can be kind of hard to recognize that stress pile up, and that because of other barriers and stigma, farmers may wait too long to get that mental health resources they need. And there's also this belief in rural America and agriculture, in other industries as well, that you should maybe just deal with your mental health problems on your own and not seek help. But also an idea that we kind of looked into was, to be able to make the definitive decision to get help, you first have to recognize that you do have a mental health problem. But you also have to believe that seeking the help is going to be beneficial to you. So I think a lot of times in the industry and in rural communities, there's kind of this idea that, what's it going to help to sit on a couch or talk to somebody for 30 minutes? Is that really going to help? Is it really going to benefit me? Is it going to be worth taking the time? So I think that's why it's so important to look for somebody who knows about your industry, who's familiar with the beef industry when you are seeking help, and making sure that there's a match there. So the New York FarmNet talked about 6 different signs to know when to get help. And they talk about changes in routine being a sign that it might be time to get help when your lifestyle's changed a little bit, when you're not living the day-to-day like you used to. Also declining care of your animals. So if you're noticing that you or someone else, you're not caring for the animals like you used to, that's a sign to reach out for help. As well as increase in illness and farm accidents, decline in the appearance of the farmstead, which kind of goes along with decline in care of animals. One that I thought was interesting was the signs of stress in children. And that kind of struck me when I was looking through this research, because a lot of times, in the industry, sometimes people are better at covering up their challenges. We tend to hide those, but kids might not be as good as that, being younger. And that, if you're looking in, it might be a telltale, how are the kids doing if, the farm is struggling, and as well as in general decreased interest. So, even if the main operator, the person who's having mental health concerns may not recognize this, if you recognize it in someone else, a lot of the literature and resources talked about how it is appropriate to have a conversation. And it also talked about how important it was to find a mental health professional to work with who knows the challenges of rural communities. And I think that's a struggle, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the towards the end. But finding someone that you understands can be a challenge for producers. So again, those 3 types of barriers that we'll focus in on is accessibility, availability, and acceptability of seeking and receiving mental health services. And the first one, under accessibility, rural residents and beef producers likewise often have to travel a long way to receive health care. And like I talked about, that can be a burden. If you have to spend half a day going to see someone because you're a couple hours away, you're even 30 minutes out, that's a challenge. And farmers and ranchers are also less likely to be insured for mental health services, and they're also less likely to recognize that there is an illness. And that can be because maybe only one of the people in the relationship or on the farm have an in-town job, and if nobody does, mental health might not be covered in their insurance. And also the availability of resources. Currently in America, there's a current and chronic shortage of mental health professionals, and even more so in rural areas. So that's a burden that hinders people from getting health care. And we also know that mental health providers are more likely to practice in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. And there's several reasons for that, but it's kind of the same idea of when I get out of college, there's a lot more options in urban areas than rural areas for me. And that can lead people to practice in more urban areas. And then from an acceptability standpoint, we talked a little bit about the stigma of needing or accepting mental health care, in that there's fewer choices of trained professionals who work in rural areas. And a few points that the literature talked about was in ag, sometimes producers or even people in rural areas are concerned that in their small communities, even though it's supposed to be confidential, they're kind of worried about the appearance or knowing that, I'm going to accept help, and that was something that hindered them from seeking mental health care when they needed it. And also, kind of like I talked about before, finding someone who will understand your lifestyle. So not everybody understands the sources of stress that farmers and ranchers face day to day. When you go seek help, you want to know that the person you're talking to understands, right? So that was kind of a barrier that they talked about a lot. So more on the rural shortage of mental health professionals. I thought this was a good graphic showing, those areas in bright green are the areas that are facing more extreme shortages. And that's not very promising if you're thinking about rural America, right? A lot of the rural areas are the places where there's less healthcare workers. And they face a lot of challenges related to recruitment and retention of those mental health workers. And they also talked about, because there's such a high no-show rate for mental health patients, and multiple of them are uninsured in rural areas, that why would I want to go open a clinic in that kind of environment? That's challenging. And some of the literature also talked about the potential for televisits, but because of connectivity issues and even acceptance of those visits, it can be hard to implement those in rural areas. So from some cases, some farmers might prefer a televisit so they can stay on their operation. But again, even if they are willing to do that, connectivity issues might make that challenging. So there actually are quite a bit of resources, and this is not a comprehensive list, but it's a few that we wanted to point out. Farm Aid works in the space of providing mental health resources for farmers. So that would be one avenue to look at. There's a few different hotlines. So the Farm and Rural Stress Hotline is available, where you can call and talk to mental health professionals that, like I said, understand the challenges of rural America and that producers face. The Farm Crisis Center, that's sponsored by the National Farmers Union, provides some really good resources for farmers who are going through stressful times. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a national resource that producers can use. And kind of like I talked about in the beginning, the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network from the USDA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, is a program that is pouring money into different state departments of agricultures and other places to get more localized resources. And that's something I'm excited about, because I think we're going to see, like I said, more localized resources that are going to have larger impacts on producers in a more targeted fashion. So we found this really interesting paper from Dr. Rudolphi, and her kind of the overview of the paper was looking at who should provide the resources to farmers in terms of mental health resources, and who would they prefer to receive those resources from. So from a mental health information standpoint, producers say they're more open to receiving those resources from medical providers, spouses and family members, and friends. They also noted that they're least open to receiving that information from people in the agribusiness profession, so attorneys, bankers, and commodity groups. And that's something that struck out to me. I think a lot of times people will say, oh, I'm just going to let the industry groups deal with that, or that's the commodity group's problem to deal with. But farmers and ranchers would really rather have personal conversations with people in their community and in their network. So while commodity groups and industry groups have a place in providing resources, it's really one-on-one conversations that are going to make an impact there. They also noted from a mental health and ag safety standpoint, they would rather that information come from newspapers or magazines, or again, one-on-one conversations, and they're at least interested in receiving that information from the internet, social media, and phone lines. So again, from a resource development standpoint, although social media and the internet's a really great tool, again, it comes down to personal relationships and community involvement, and I think that's really where we're going to see a difference made. So in conclusion, we talked a little bit about the unique lifestyle and demographics that many cattle producers have, and how it makes it different the mental health conversation in the industry different than other industries. And that as we work towards improving social sustainability in the industry, focusing on mental health is going to be so important. But we also have to think about, again, those key differences in the industry, and how, when we're having these conversations, we need to have a wide overview and systems thinking of it, because agriculture and the beef industry impacts so many industries, but they're also impacted by other industries, which can increase the stress. So, we need to think specifically about farmers and ranchers, but also consider how we all work together in this conversation. So kind of, like Mariah talked about, one of the goals was to understand the lacks of research and the gaps that were out there on the subject. So although in general, there is quite a bit of literature on the mental health in rural communities in the agriculture industry, there is a lack of research that breaks down differences between specific commodity groups. And from a resource development standpoint, we think that understanding differences in commodity groups and their producers, we would be able to work, better serve producers if we understand that a little bit better. And in general, other areas needed were more understanding on the stigma that impacts the industry. And kind of like I noted, farmers and ranchers continually recognize the economic conditions as one of the top two impacts on their mental health and stress. So understanding how different economic decisions can impact mental health, I think from a national level down to local levels is really important to consider in different decisions. And also how we can best relate mental health information and resources to farmers to make sure the resources we are developing have big breadth of impact. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
So I find it interesting, a lot of the things that you found that felt like could feed into. How about the age of farmers and ranchers? Because technically they're, what are they, in their 60s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but how does that affect, do you find more mental illness in the older generation or the younger generation? Because I feel like they have different stresses.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. You can look at that either way. Kind of like I talked about in the beginning, how older producers probably face more general health challenges, which can impact how they're operate from day to day. So they're facing more physical challenges probably, but younger producers face a different type of challenge. Acquiring land. They might have less resources than older, more established farmers. So I don't know if it's that one faces more mental health challenges than the other. It's just that, like you said, the type of challenges they face are different.
And kind of the way that they deal with them are different too.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a caregiver for my mother-in-law who's 89, and I take her to her monthly doctor's appointment, and the doctor walks in and says, "How are you doing?" "Fine." "No, you're not." So that's what they're conditioned, though, that the doctor is an authoritative figure.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily interact in the same way as that the younger generation, I think, is very confident in saying, "Hey, I'm not doing okay."
Yeah.
Right? At least to that figure. I just would think that's an interesting thing to add in.
Yeah, for sure. And even, a lot of my peers that didn't grow up on a farm have a different view on mental health than me, even because of the type of environment I was grown up in. So, it's just the environment and, the way you were raised can impact those types of things.
It's very true.
Yes.
Amber, you talked a lot about how different stresses lead to different mental health and producers. What about the downstream effects of how that mental health affects the future of that operation? So, have you done a deep dive into the industry? Something unique among the farmer rancher demographic, other than kind of have literature among the whole population about what mental health does for humans, right?
Yeah.
What about in that demographic? Is there something specific? Are they more prone to lose the operation? Does it affect profitability?
Yeah.
Speak to that.
So with NCBA and at GLC, I also worked on a generational transfer piece, and I'm probably pulling this more from that than the mental health research. But in that work, it talked about how when you grow up watching your parents struggle to keep your operation profitable or in production, that can kind of change, if you want to go back and work that same piece of land. So if you seen your family struggle and struggle and struggle, it's kind of hard to say, I'm going to go take that over, right? So I think if you see, those problems in your family, it can hurt the transition of that operation. And like you said, it also has, like Mariah talked about, relating the economic, environmental, and social pieces. When you're struggling in one area, that impacts the other area. So there's lots of trade-offs to think about and connections to see span across. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Amber. I appreciate, Amber, you taking on the challenge and looking into this. It's definitely an important subject matter that a lot of us want to look the other way. And I think we will, tomorrow morning's opening session, we'll definitely have 3 different producers sharing their stories and their concerns. Let's see if I can find Debbie, our next. So we'll transition to the next talk, kind of with my partner in crime with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, Miss Debbie Lyons-Blythe, cow-calf operator, mom, blogger, just a little of everything, superwoman. And it's always a pleasure to work with Debbie out of White City, Kansas. And Debbie, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, stay here. You're not allowed to get too far.
All right.
We're going to work together on this. So Chad and I have actually been working together for a long time. We've been the co-chairs, along with one other guy, for the outreach subcommittee. And right now, or working group, I guess that working group is the one that's really getting fired up. So the roundtable, the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has done an awful lot of work. And now we're doing the outreach. We're trying to get the information out to you all and getting you to interact with all of the work that we've accomplished. So we're going to just get just a little bit of it here and see if we can do some outreach, Chad. I'm going to let you go ahead and hit the last few years.
Yeah, so, the mission of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is really about advancing and support and communicate continuous improvement of sustainability across the U.S. Beef value chain. Right, it's kind of the things that we're talking about and what we're here about Nat GLC. Nat GLC was one of the first members that signed up and became a partner of the roundtable because of the importance when we think about grazing and sustainability and all that. It's what the roundtable is pushing. The really vision is around the U.S. beef value chain is the trusted global leader in environmentally sound and socially responsible and economically viable beef.
Right, so the first thing that we had to do was to define what sustainability means, right? And so within the roundtable, we have members, we're a true roundtable. We have members from the producer sector, the feed yard sector, the auction market sector, help me remember them all, the
producer or process, packer
processor, feed yards, and even retailers, non-government organizations like Nat GLC, and then of course certain allied industry have joined us.
Academia as well.
Oh yes, academia, cannot forget those guys. Anyway, so we had to all agree on what the definition of sustainability is, and Mariah and Amber kind of touched on it, and so does our vision touch on it, but I'm just going to give it to you the way I speak to either other ranchers or to consumers or anybody that I talk about sustainability for U.S. beef is take care of the land, take care of the animals, take care of the people, and make money. Everybody nods their heads, typically that. So that was our first step. We had to define sustainability, and then we had to figure out how we were going to measure it. We're at the point now where we're going to start showing you how we recommend it being measured. And I want to say this was really a trick because as the producer sector talked about how we would measure sustainability at the farm, we did it ourselves, right? So all of the producers got together in a room many, many, many times. And with the help of sometimes allied industry and some of the organizations would assist us. But we got to decide how we measured sustainability on the farm. The feed yards got to decide how they would measure sustainability on the feed yard. And each sector themselves, we are measuring every indicator. I didn't write down the key indicators that we identified, but there's 6 key indicators that we measure sustainability across the entire beef value chain, which is really key to me. Let's try. Water, land, greenhouse gases. Those are the easy ones. Worker safety, animal health and welfare, and economics and efficiency, right? Okay, that's close. That's pretty much what they're, I'm not sure that's the appropriate names, but we're measuring those at every single level. Ultimately, when we each came up with the ways that we wanted to measure within each sector, then we presented it to the whole group, and we were able to have input on the ways. So like the retailers decided how they're going to measure, say, greenhouse gases, right? They want to discuss food waste. And food waste is an absolutely huge problem in America, and they want to send less waste to landfills where it emits methane, right? So that is a great way, and we said at the time, excellent. Well, we were discussing greenhouse gases at the producer level, and as you all know, it's really hard to measure, right? It's really difficult. So we were struggling, and they said, why don't you just use the same question that you're using for your land and water resources? Why don't you say, do you have a grazing management plan? If you have a grazing management plan, you are impacting land, water, and greenhouse gases. So that is our question. Even though the retail sector said we should do that, we are the ones that said, yes, that is how we will measure it on the farm and ranch. It's a lot more involved, actually, how the measurements are, but that's the foundation. And to me, the point that I want to make to you is we decided what we're going to talk about. So that's pretty much it on the indicators that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, and that's the key, and you mentioned it, Debbie, is that each sector developed their own questions and their thoughts, and I think that's much better. I mean, it's a lot harder as us producers if we had retail saying you need to do X, or vice versa, us telling the retailers you need to do X. And so, but having that input and dialogue definitely helped move the process. And I think the other thing that's nice is it's not one sector that all the weight's on. It's every sector has their part to be better. So
I totally agree. I think that was really a huge value of it. So the next step is to get everybody to start interacting with our information, and we have created some outreach modules for each sector, and we're going to dig into and show you specifically one for the cow-calf sector. This is the whole list of the modules that are available now. They are online, they are free, we do not gather any information, they are interactive and you do answer questions, but we don't save any of that information. The only thing we want to save is where you're from and what sector you're from. That's all we want to know, so that if there's a whole bunch of people in Kansas, because I've been going around to places in Kansas trying to get them to answer this, well, so then we know we need to reach out to certain states that we don't maybe have anybody. So those are the only thing that we are gathering at this point. We've talked a lot about grazing management. Chad said, let's not talk about a grazing management plan. This group already knows grazing. Makes good sense. Let's talk about transition planning. So we're going to dig into our transition planning module. You have anything to... There it is,
yeah.
A family. There's that family. I think one of the keys to remember is that if you have a transition plan, you are more likely to be able to keep your grass in grass, right? If you don't have a plan as to how it's going to get passed down, it might be sold piece by piece. It might be the family might inherit it all together, but they can't afford to keep it, so they have to sell one piece off. If you have a transition plan that you are able to keep it all together and transition it seamlessly to the next generation, it is much more likely to stay in grassland, and that's what we need. So I'm just going to show you screenshots from the modules. Obviously, transition, it's all about financial health, future generations, it's passing it on, all those kind of important things. So this is one of the questions where it kind of starts asking you specific things. There's no right or wrong answer, right? You all will have a different answer to this possibly, or the people that you are able to guide towards our modules. So it just makes people think, what matters to you most regarding the transition of your operation to future owners? Okay, so each of us are probably gonna have a different thing, and it's not gonna save that, but it just makes you think. Right? So many different people, these are just some of the key. Is it most important as the mom that's looking to make this plan and pass this down? What's the most important thing? Is it the fact that family maintains the ownership? Is it the fact that we have made a good decision in the ranch and it's worth passing down financially? Can my kids make a living? Right? That's a very important question for me. The legacy matters to us.
Legacy, heritage. Yeah.
That's it, man. Our ranch was founded in 1890, and we're really proud of that heritage. I mean, gosh, people always say I'm a 4th generation or 5th generation rancher, and that matters.
Yeah.
That's really important, and it's in agriculture. So I'm just waiting on Chad to jump in on any of this as he's going, because we've kind of been working through all of these. Chad and I, we were involved in actually going through these piece by piece before they were easy and to be able to go through them too. So just remembering where we're at with. But what worries you the most, right? What is the most scary? And I was looking at the poster out here too. There's a poster that has that, and it actually has a place for you to check mark. Do you have a plan? And what was the hardest thing starting your plan? And what if you haven't started it, why not, right? And I love that poster, and I would love to be able to gather your information about that. But really, what is it that scares you about starting a plan? What is the biggest barrier? It's going to be different for everybody.
Everybody, yep. The hardest part and the scariest part is the starting and having the discussion.
Probably so. Yeah. So I'll share with you that we have a plan. My family, I've got 5 kids, and we have been passing down the ranch already for many years, but I think we're at a point now where it needs rediscussed, right? So our kids are now getting married. Our kids are now, well, nobody's pregnant, but hopefully one of these days we'll have one of those, right? We have a puppy, but anyway, puppy's not gonna inherit. But I think it's important that it be a living document, right? So it was not so hard when they were just our kids to have this discussion. Now that we have spouses and soon-to-be spouses in this conversation, the question is, how do we include them? And my husband and I are trying to decide exactly how to have that conversation with spouses involved, because here's an interesting aside. I was a spouse. We are on my husband's land that was his family's land. I was brought into the family, but honestly, it would not be where it is today if it were not for me. My husband works off the farm, and I'm there. So what's appropriate, right? And it's going to be different for everybody.
The key point you said, Debbie, and I think a lot of times we think it's stagnant, what we say today, and it's just like a grazing management plan, this transition and plan. It should be a living document, as you mentioned, and it should be readdressed.
I totally agree. So where to start? They should just do it. So just continuing to show you some of the screenshots as we go, and remember that these modules are to get people to interact with the information. We are not giving them exactly how to start a plan. They're not going to finish this module and have their transition plan done. No, but hopefully we will show them that it's not afraid, or it's not a reason to be afraid, right? It is something that can be done, and it can be fairly easy if you help identify the right things. So basically it just says, what is it? It guides ownership, management, and labor to the next generation, preserves family harmony and business success, and it will require significant time and effort. As I've shown, it's going to be a continuous thing. But the statistic that I thought that was so interesting that we included on this slide is that more than 1/3 of ag operations right now in America are expected to transition within the next 2 decades, and I think it may be even faster.
I think it's much faster.
Because we've got, what did they say, 62, 65 is the median age?
Yeah, and I think you add other dynamics, right, of our political realm and where we are with the transition. I think those get the things thinking of further of what are those other tax components and those things that it's definitely
and it's been so
faster.
changeable.
Yes.
right? All of that from administration to administration, all of that has been so changeable that we need to make sure that we are doing the right thing to make sure that your kids can inherit and continue the ranch. So more questions, self-assessment questions. So first of all, it asks if you have a plan, right? So when you click yes or no, doesn't save it, but it sticks in my brain what I answered, right? I like this interactive deal here. So at the bottom are the things that kind of the foundation of a plan, and you are to click and drag them into the various places. Have you started it? Is it something you've finished, or it's not yet being dealt with? So this actually makes you interact with it, and we find that helps to cement it in your brain just a tick more. So as you can see, the different parts of it and things that are concerned with a transition plan. And in this, then, we talk about more in depth each one of those a little bit, some of the things that are important within a transition plan. We'll just click through these tabs pretty quickly. But so inventory, you need an inventory, not just about all of your cows, right? You want to inventory all of your resources. So you want to talk about all of the land, you want to talk about your debt, you want to talk about your assets. You want to, honestly, we included our strengths, each individual person. What are your strengths? I've got one kid that loves to farm, but he really doesn't want to tag calves in the first early morning, right? I got another kid that is very willing to do all of the paperwork for the registered Angus operation, and I am so ready for him to take that over. But he doesn't really like to sit on a tractor very long. So we've got value in different people, so I think that's important in inventory. Go ahead.
So the other one is really have a discussion of the values, right? Have that interaction of the family and visiting through this, the goals, objectives, the roles, as Debbie mentioned, of I think some of the responsibilities and some of those assets that each family member brings into that operation. In the daily operation, the marketing, the production. I mean, there's so many areas. When we think about it, it's not just the cows. It's a business, right? And trying to keep the business running long term.
And conversation, right?
Yep.
Get it all started. I think one of the key things for me is that it's not just up to me, right? So just because I'm the parent, my husband and I are the parents, we don't have to be the smartest ones in the room. Right, so that advisory team is really, really key. It could be somebody from the Grazing Land Coalition. It could be the local extension agent. It could be NRCS, who is helping guide us as to what we need to do with the land. Ultimately, you're going to need a lawyer. You're probably going to need a financial advisor and some like that. But I think it's really key that we don't feel like we have to know everything. I do think that's something that a lot of my generation and older thinks. We're not as comfortable asking questions and saying, well, I don't know that, right? There's younger people are very comfortable asking questions, I feel like. And so that's a tremendous value. We don't have to know everything. You can rely on a tremendous team.
And really talk about, evaluate the effectiveness of your business structure. I think it's a key one, right? When we think about, are we a limited liability company? What is that structure? How does that structure, does it give us the flexibility of moving down to that next generation and those aspects?
Yep, because there's lots of options.
A lot of options. And there's not a right way. It has to fit the goals and objectives and the individual family operation.
Yep. And one of the important deals has to also be considering a conservation easement. Right? So in my area, I'm probably not going to get a parking lot, like Meredith said. I'm probably not going to have a big parking lot in mind, but I do think that there are opportunities that somebody could subdivide and break off into hunting properties, and that would tremendously devastate our area. So I feel like that a conservation easement can be something to discuss.
Yeah, it's a definitely aspect of it. The other thing about a conservation easement, there's multiple types of conservation easements. So when we think about it from a fully 100% donated conservation easement, actually can be a great tool from an estate planning. Mm-hmm. Lower some of those values, some of that aspect to utilize when we're thinking about this long-term heritage and going down to the next generation. there's also the aspect of a purchased conservation easement. It actually becomes a way, and it's a tool that I talk to a lot of families, is that if we do a purchased easement and we have multiple siblings, as we utilize you as an example, Debbie, of 5 children, right? And we have those 5 children, we put a conservation easement, and it's a, say if it's a purchased easement, we can utilize those dollars from that purchase to actually build an endowment for the operation. So when that day comes, you ask sister to, hey, we had all of these things happen and you need to write a $25,000 check. They may say, well, wait a minute, they have a job in town, they're expecting money, income coming in. So it's a great tool for multiple ways and layering in of that transfer of that succession, for sure.
I knew you'd have lots to add on that one.
Yeah.
We could do the whole presentation on that, couldn't we? Excellent. And then maybe even it needs to be placed in trust. So just an example, my husband's grandfather did a tremendous service to his grandkids by placing certain pieces of his property in a trust for all of his grandkids. My husband's sisters, the 3 of them are the youngest of all the cousins, and so we really would not have had much connection with the rest of the family if we hadn't have had that trust. In addition, we're the only ones home, my husband and I. So the fact that it was in a trust with us labeled as the manager was very, very helpful, and us able to really be able to interact with everybody on a very professional way. So trusts can also be a good way to consider. This just hits all of those key considerations, lists them again. We don't need to run through that again. I'm just doing screenshots, but as it reads to you in a very professional voice, it's not my voice, so it's not why I'm saying that. It just reads and check marks them off for you interactively. At the end of each of these modules, it asks then some survey questions. This information is not tied to who logged into the module, but just basically says, did we do a good job with the information in the module? And I feel like so far we've had really good responses.
Right. And that helps us guide and adjust and move forward and make it easy.
Yeah, and once again, this is going to be a changeable situation as well. Okay, so once again, these are the ones that are the cow-calf, stalker, and backgrounder. And I know stalkers and backgrounders are not exactly like cow-calf, but they do deal with on the grass, right? So we kind of put them all together. But I'd like to show you, I guess we'll talk about the toolkit. I'll talk to you about the other sectors coming up too. Each sector has their own toolkit for each module, which means it's where we got the information, right? As well as where you can get the information to give a presentation, to just dig in more in depth into the information, okay? So I want to point out really clearly, the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef gathered this information from other smart people. We are not preaching to anybody. We are not saying we are the expert on transition planning. We definitely got this information from others. So we make sure that those people like you all are identified for more information. So as you click through some of those, you can see we've got University of Wyoming, California Trust News, Land Trust Alliance. I guess if anybody has any others that they suggest that we add to this list specifically for transition planning, we'd be wide open.
Most definitely. And that's the key, is that we're trying to develop, get you thinking through the thinking process, but more importantly, provide the linkage to more information to gather, and we'll see that more in the self-assessment as we get to that, and the reason and how that was developed.
Excellent. So this is the rest of the toolkit for succession and transfer, and I just want to read some of these questions. So we gathered these from yet another resource, and I'm just going to read through these because I'm asking these of our family right now. Important questions to ask the parents. What's the most important non-financial outcome you would like to achieve with an estate plan? Of course, there's no right or wrong answer, right? We're just asking the parents what they think. How likely would your current lender be to continue to lend money if the current owners pass away? I think that one's really key. And we're seeing an awful lot with financial institutions and the word sustainability these days. How have you or will you pass on knowledge to the next generation? So our grazing management plan is a huge part of our transition plan, because my son, who is home on the ranch, is 27. He doesn't always listen to his mom. So as I'm able to say things to him and remind him of things, it's also based in our grazing management plan. We are not just passing on the ranch, we're trying to pass on knowledge too. And then another question that's really key for the parents is, what do you see as your involvement in 5, 10, and 20 years, right? How quickly are you wanting to phase out, or do you want to phase out? So questions then for the kids: where do you see yourself in 5, 10, or 25 years? Where do you see the farm or ranch in that time frame as well? Because those are two totally different questions. Do you want to be involved? What's your comfort level of having to personally guarantee the debt of the ranch, like you said? A lot of those off-farm owners are not interested in guaranteeing the debt. If you had to share the ranch with a non-operating sibling, how would you feel? Right? So we need to make sure that we've covered all of these questions and know what to do with these questions. And then, the underlying question that I thought was really key: what does it mean to be a member of this family? Okay, so in my sense, what does it mean to be a Blythe? And does that mean you have to have your feet on the ground all the time with us, right? Maybe it doesn't, but your roots are here, and maybe that's what you want. So with 5 in my family, hope some of them are just pretty happy with their roots being there, but I think that's really key. And how does that pass to them? And you have to remember, equal is not always fair.
That is exactly. And I think this also, hits the point that you already mentioned, Debbie, is that having those, maybe a third party, that other trusted source that's outside, to really ask these questions so everybody can be honest. And you got to just be able to be honest and say each family member to lay out their thoughts and not back. Because the worst thing that you see is 5 years, 10 years from now, you didn't say what you wish you would have said, and
Yes.
decisions were made, and that's when feelings get hurt. So.
Yep, and that is especially poignant for us right now because my husband is actually an estate planner and an investment banker. And so I know he has the skills to ask those questions of our kids, but I'm not going to let him do it.
No.
We've got to bring in a third party so that they will be sure to be honest and be able to say what they need to say and not to their dad.
Exactly.
Okay, quick we're going to show you a few of the things that are in the other sector modules. These are the auction market modules. They were created in coordination with the Livestock Marketing Association. So the things that they touch, right, with all of the different indicators that we mentioned are animals, employees definitely, and then the land and water. So they've got modules specifically about that. Feed yard modules. They address the same kind of things.
And I think the key thing, again, to stress is that each sector developed these. So these were the feed yard guys sitting in a room developing these and putting these modules together as well.
And what really, really matters to them, right? And how they can measure sustainability. So we have packer and processor modules as well, based on all of that information that they decided how to measure. The other thing is as a cattle rancher, I have found that there's quite a few people that feel really good knowing that they can go through these and that it's okay if they go look at what the packer and processor are doing too, right? That they don't have to just look at the producer modules. They can look and see at all of them. And the retail and food service modules are coming very soon. So those will be here before the end of the year, I believe. We're this close.
We're very close, right at the finish line.
Very close. So I'm going to let Chad really hit all of this with the self-assessment tool. This was his baby.
Yeah, so one of the key things, right, is the self-assessment tool. And it was an area that when we talked about all the sectors from that, and this was some time, and it still resides there at Noble Research Institute, is that each sector can click your sector, and it asks you these key questions that tie back to those metrics of what we're trying to measure. A couple of important things. The first one is that this information is not saved. So it's a good and bad at the same time, because a lot of times we get halfway through it and we got to go, something happens at the ranch and we're back to it and we forget where we are and we have to start over. So the way that to save it is there's a PDF button at the end to save a hard copy or electronic copy of your materials. But the key to it is that we're going through these key questions it helps guide, it helps you think through that process. But more importantly, it kind of gives you a snapshot in time, and then you can compare where you are of your overall score on sustainability, but also the six indicators that we're looking at measuring from not just the cow-calf, but every sector. I think one of the other components is that we wanted to basically be able to help empower and give you more information. So these are the key questions that are asked. You have this color-coded of green, I'm doing good, yellow is a caution, or, I may not be doing bad, but, I could, and red is also, an area that we may need to improve, we may need to look at. But maybe it's I have a red on the succession plan, and I don't know where to start. And there's the aspect where you can click on the far right, click more information, and it brings up more information to your area to help you kind of guide you to the key things and information to help you and empower you to move forward.
That's usually the very first thing that I send people if they're interested in interacting with the term sustainability and what it means on their ranch. I send them a link to that, and then they fill that out and they go, oh, okay, that's what it means. And then they're interested in digging deeper. So here's where both of those two resources are: usrsb.org/resources. So that's a lot of S's in that word. But yeah, so it is easily accessible, doesn't record anything besides your state and your sector. So happy to have everybody interact with that. And with that, do you have any questions? Anything about the roundtable or anything that you want to know about our outreach happening from here on out? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have numbers on how many people have gone through your module?
We do, but I cannot pull those up. I didn't even think about answering that at this time. We are actually just really gearing up now. We wanted to have a full slate of them, so I've been making a few presentations, getting a few people involved. We're from here on out, man. We're firing up. Hopefully, but we have had quite a few people already. But
one of the key things I think from National Cattlemen's Beef Association has had a partnership with Cargill,
Good job.
and Cargill helped put funds. And so one of the things is actually put, like for this conference, was one that was allowed for more information to help producers get to events. They go through the modules, they go through these ideas, they take some pictures of themselves at the conference, what they learned, and then they get $750 scholarship to help pay and some of that. And so that's another good way and a good incentive to help guide people there. We had a number at this conference that went through that process, and we really appreciate Cargill and NCBA for allowing that. On the self-assessment component, Noble kind of keeps care of those and then sends those to the US RSB on those uptake and clicks through the self-assessment. But we're definitely seeing an improvement as we move forward.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yes.
What have you come up with that you consider fair but not necessarily equal if you got more than one child?
Yeah, well, that could be a whole presentation, wouldn't it be? Yeah. So with my 5 kids, it's hard. It's really hard. And I'm not going to have the answer for you, but I will just tell you an example of what's going on in our world is our oldest son is third in line with age. My girls did not come straight home to the ranch, but my oldest son came home directly from college despite the fact that we told him he needed to go somewhere else first. Our next 2 sons did what they were told. They went somewhere else first. So we've got a 4-year lag in there between the time that the oldest boy came home and the next 2 came home, but they want to be just as involved, but they've been gone for 4 years, right? So how do you balance that? And how do you balance the fact that we've done new things because one's home already, right? All of those questions have to weigh into what the decisions are, right? I don't have the answer on all of that yet, but I think the kids have to help me lead me to those answers too. Right? And that's why I really don't want me or their dad to ask those questions.
Exactly.
I want a third party to say, what do you foresee? How do you want this handled? And then we can hammer it out from there. But if nobody's willing to step up and say what they want, then my husband and I are going to do something, but is it right or not?
In my situation, I have 3 kids. The youngest boy has no interest in farming, so that's eliminated that problem.
Well, it sounds like you've got a good team advising you, and that's the bottom line, I think. That's really important. Yep. Got two more questions here. Amber in the back has raised her hand. Sorry, Jeff.
I guess my question is, if you don't have someone who is interested in your family taking over the operation, has US RSP looked into different avenues of like getting a working ranch in the hands of a young producer who doesn't have one that they can take over? Or is that something that US RSP like you think it's a good place for them to get
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think definitely a concern, right? And we're seeing more and more of that. And you talked about it on your presentation. I don't think that's USRSB's aspect. It's trying to find maybe information, right, of us. Is there resources towards that of finding, new and beginning farmers or other ways and avenues or other tools? And some of that, could be easements. I mean, there's other ways of restructuring some of those. So we wouldn't say one way or the other. It's how do we gather some of that, what you're saying, and providing that information to help more information for those families to make the best decision for them and that avenue for them.
Right, and it sounds like you've been working on some of this, so if you have
Yep.
some resource links for us, we would be very interested in that. So yeah, Jeff? This is going to be a tough one, I can tell.
Yep.
We've put him off.
I understand that the Roundtable did not, they wanted to develop a framework where all of the sectors have their own voice and what sustainability meant to them. Have you seen any third parties, or may have already started to use the metrics and indicators as a framework for third-party verification?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so yes, Jeff. I mean, there's what do we call it, Mariah? The program recognition.
It's a working group.
Yeah,
Yep.
working group program recognition. So there's different programs that can take that framework, develop a system that goes through the value chain on the back end, and together they bring those programs together. There's a committee that reviews, and actually a third party reviews those programs and make sure that they do meet all of that framework and have all of those components, and then they're kind of go through a process and are stamped. So the big thing from the USRSB was us not to dictate or try to develop another another NASCAR or whatever, right, from a stamp, but we wanted to build that framework where others could take that, and because it's really a business to business decision and that's not part of USRSB's goal or mission or vision or our part in this.
But I think ultimately we do have excellent metrics that have been agreed upon all up and down the value chain.
Yeah.
The retailers, in addition, who are the ones that have asked and from before this started 6 years ago, they were the ones pushing to make us do something, right? So they've agreed that these are good metrics. It would be awesome if somebody would grab a hold of this and be able to create some sort of a program that are best management practices based on our metrics, and we're anxious for somebody to do that.
One example, for you in your area would be the Integrity Beef, right? Their sustainability program has been one of those programs that has gone through that process and is available. So.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have rack cards to pass out, so you can get knowledge about this out to people?
As there's a website.
Yeah.
We're
How are you advertising to get this?
so first of all, we are looking inward to number one, our membership, right? The people that are members, but also the people that are our stakeholders, right? And so we are appearing at meetings like this, and we are trying to reach out. We are doing, from here on, we're going to be announcing our overarching sustainability goals for the entire beef industry. This is a pretty big deal. We're finalizing those. Those will be available in April, and there will be a huge outreach specifically to people within the value chain. We are not a consumer-facing industry, so we're not going to push specifically out to the consumers, but we're going to give information to those who need to reach the consumers. I think one of the challenges that I have in the next year is to reach specifically the producers, the farm and ranch level, And I'm going to work really hard to get out and attend meetings and write lots of articles and things like that to make sure that the producers can see that sustainability is important on the farm and ranch, and it's attainable. So thank you. I'll take your information and have you help me. No, I appreciate that, though. That's part of being here.
Well, I've seen some information on a couple different websites that I, get notifications from, and but I don't see it a lot. If you're not actively on some of those sites,
Yeah.
you're gonna miss it.
You're right.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I think one of the key areas, which, hindsight, right? We were still trying to develop these tools and resources. And so we did a lot of our outreach was just really around the mission, the vision, those things. And so now, since we just kind of wrapping up all these modules and all that toolkit component, as Debbie mentioned, now it's that wrapping up this next year of really getting the information out.
We're right on the cusp of that outreach. So she's just defined our job for us,
Yes,
Mr.
yes.
Co-Chair of Outreach
Yeah,
Subcommittee.
sounds like you and I have some work to do.
Little work to do. Yep. All right, if there's no other questions, we're going to be around. Obviously, Chad's going to be around the whole time. I'll be around most of the time still, and happy to continue to discuss it. Thank you all.